Welcome to the Europa Universalis 5 guide, which will allow you to set your country on the path to becoming much richer and more powerful, thanks to an in-depth understanding of three key mechanics: proximity to capital, control, and market access. I explained the basic things regarding these topics in that guide. The link is in the description. And in the current video, you will receive much more extensive knowledge, while the basics will only be briefly recalled. Welcome imperialists, Lucas here, coming to you with the news that a big sale is currently underway at this channel's partner due to Black Friday. To take advantage of the offer, you need to go through the link in the description. As you can see, there are many great deals here, available in many currencies, recommended by Lucas. I often buy here myself. And if you'd like to buy EU5 and support my channel at the same time, you'll find my affiliate link in the description. Thank you in advance. I'll start by explaining how your country is structured. The smallest administrative unit is a location. Here it is, and here is its information panel. Locations are grouped into provinces, which are slightly larger areas. Of course, every country consists of many such locations. Castile, for example. There are also locations not assigned to any country, but over time someone may conquer them, and ultimately all locations belong to some market. My example location belongs to the market in Seville. And naturally, it's in the locations where all the magic of this gameplay happens. This is where you will construct buildings to increase your income, look after population growth, and have the possibility of recruiting levies, as well as regular armies. And essentially, the effectiveness of all your locations is influenced to a greater or lesser extent, directly or indirectly, by these statistics. How and to what degree, you will find out in a moment. Let's now move to Cordoba, because I know how to pronounce the name of this location. And I'll show you where on this panel you can find the representation of the mechanics I'm talking about. Proximity to capital is located here. Control is in two places, right next to it and here. And market access is a bit off to the side and located here. There is also a graphical representation of all this information in the form of maps. Proximity to capital, control map, and for market access, simply the market map. Without a doubt, the most important location for every country is its capital. In this example save for my Castile, that is Cordoba, among other reasons, because the capital is the source that generates 100 proximity points. At the same time, your capital does not have to be your trade capital, which you can recognize by the fact that Cordoba's market access is only 87%. If you go to the markets tab in the economy section, you'll see that for this area, the trade capital is Seville, and here the market access is 100%. It's useful to distinguish simply between the capital and the trade capital. Of the three mentioned statistics, control is the most important. Low control causes a given location to become practically useless to you. I'll talk much more about control in a moment. Because initially proximity is the most important statistic, since without it you won't have high control. That's why I'm starting the explanation of mechanics with proximity. Proximity is a statistic that informs you how easily your capital can control nearby locations, or from other proximity sources, but more on that later, because throughout your entire game, the capital remains the main and largest source. Locations that have high proximity usually also have high control, because from all the modifiers, proximity is often the largest value. And where your proximity no longer reaches, control is often much lower. Control itself affects many statistics. More on that later. With the proximity to capital map enabled, notice that I clicked on the province of Mérida and it created a path here. This path shows you how proximity travels from location to location until it reaches the destination. And it works in a very simple way. In Cordoba I have 100 proximity points, but moving from Cordoba to Palma consumes 6.84 proximity points. Therefore, proximity in Palma is already 93.15. That one decimal difference is just classic paradox math. Then proximity continues from Palma to Azuaga. But here the travel cost is higher, 28.44 plus the earlier 6.84, which results in the final proximity being 64.70 because the 100 proximity points were reduced by these two values. And so the travel costs of proximity keep being subtracted from 100 as it moves from location to location until Mérida. And yes, you're right, the game automatically chooses the most efficient path, so that the cost is always as low as possible. Now, when you look at Cáceres, you'll see that proximity is no longer spreading here, because we would fall into negative values and proximity cannot negatively affect control. it is purely a positive modifier. Let's now return to the location called Merida and examine this tooltip. You can clearly see that the costs of moving between different locations are not the same, and even just looking at the map, you can see clearly that on the left you have more green provinces, high proximity, and on the right more red ones, low proximity. This is simply due to many modifiers, but briefly I'll explain to you how it is calculated so you may become a happier person. Divided into land proximity and sea proximity, because that exists too. The base cost of moving between land locations is 40 points, meaning that if these other statistics didn't exist, the travel cost from Cordoba to Palma would be 40, and proximity in Palma wouldn't be 93% but 60%. But thankfully, we can influence this base cost first through flat modifiers, and this is very simple because there are only two sources of such modifiers. The first one is rivers, as you can see in this tooltip. A river flowing downstream gives -30, upstream gives -10. I don't know why, but there is no river view available in the map modes, though in the options you can bind keys to enable a river overlay. Thanks to that, you can easily check where rivers are, but unfortunately not in which direction they flow. Then there are roads. The basic version available from the start of the game gives -20. Rivers are matched only by a modern road and surpassed by railroads to endgame things. With roads, it's also worth checking whether a road leads out of your capital in every possible direction. And sometimes it's good to check that in individual locations too, because notice that here the map shows a road, but it doesn't lead into every adjacent location, which means proximity might sometimes be calculated around a long way. And that's all! There are no additional flat modifiers that reduce proximity costs. And if there are, then it will be a surprise for me. Then we have a whole mass of percentage modifiers, there are a lot of them. They vary widely and can be found practically everywhere. And they are calculated from the amount that remains once we subtract the flat bonuses from the base cost. In this case, the base cost drops to 10 points. The total percentage is this. Then we perform this simple calculation, which results in this amount, which gives the value you can now see in this tooltip. As you can see, it's very simple. And now I'll say a bit more about percentage modifiers, where to get them and where they appear. Two of the most important and usually negative modifiers are topography. For example, mountains increase proximity cost by 50%, but on flatlands this cost does not exist. Then we have vegetation. In forest the cost is increased by 25%, whereas with sparse vegetation this penalty is gone. And unfortunately, we cannot do anything about either of these two things. We cannot remove mountains, we cannot cut down forests. That's why the proper placement of the capital, considering topography, rivers and vegetation, is very important. Next, we have a statistic that you can find here, and that is simply provincial development. Development is influenced mainly by prosperity, but also by building roads. Information about prosperity can be found right next to it. Here the average population satisfaction is very important. Next, we have bonuses from buildings. Bridges reduce proximity costs by 5%, and they can only be built in locations where you have both a river and a road. That's why at some point it becomes worthwhile to build roads along rivers. With technological progress, you unlock another type of buildings, for example, canals, which can be built only in large cities that also fulfill additional conditions. Of course, there are many more such buildings, and some nations have unique buildings. Some national values, for example centralization and land orientation, also affect proximity. More reductions to proximity costs can be found in laws, such as the itinerant code. Countries can also have unique laws. Here is an example for Castile. In privileges, I haven't yet encountered one that positively affects proximity, but maybe such a thing exists somewhere. Your government type can also include something that reduces proximity. Here is an example with ports, which I will talk about shortly. Within technology, you may have unique technologies that reduce proximity, and new ones will appear as you progress through the eras. And then there are the administrative skills of your rulers. That's why I consider the administrative stat to be the most important one for every ruler. Over time, I will try to add all proximity sources to the description of this video. If such a section appears on the EU5 wiki, I will add it as well, so you can have a complete list of such modifiers. That's everything regarding distance cost on land. Now let's move to distance cost across seas, where if you look at this map, you will see that proximity is sometimes calculated in very strange ways. The best example is the journey to Gibraltar, where up to this point we have the land portion of the journey, and below it the sea portion. And when we travel by land, every step uses the land land proximity cost, but when we switch from land travel to sea travel, the port exit cost appears. Then, as long as we are traveling through the seas, depending on the type of waters, these costs vary, and when we arrive at the destination location, we again pay the port entry cost. Of course, the port cost is reduced by all the general proximity modifiers, but the most important one is the new stat that was added, harbor capacity. You can find the location's capacity here or by using the port capacity map. It's also worth mentioning the map of natural port locations. These are coastal locations that have natural predispositions to be ports. At the beginning of the game, these two maps are identical. And when you look at the tooltip in Seville, you will see a natural port that increases natural capacity by 0.55 points. You can also see that buildings increase capacity here, for example, docks. With tech progress, better docks appear, and later several trade buildings also improve capacity. However, at the beginning of the game, natural ports are the most important and worth paying attention to, because they greatly reduce the cost of sea travel both on exit and entry. That's why my journey from Seville to Marbella goes through the port in Gibraltar, because from there the route continues on land, which is cheaper since Marbella has no port bonuses. But there is a road between Marbella and Gibraltar. So we've explained entry and exit, now let's look at sea locations. Here Paradox made things a bit complicated because there are two numerical values influencing them, maritime travel cost and open sea travel cost, with a combined base of 35 points, so only slightly better than land travel. Sea travel cost is reduced by the national value called naval. It is the opposite of land orientation, and of course these values are mutually exclusive, and by the maritime presence of your fleet. What is that? I'll explain in a moment. And again, when the flat values are calculated, only then do all percentage values apply. Over time, sea travel will become increasingly efficient, essentially until railroads are invented. One reason is the bonuses you receive with technology specific to sea travel, but mainly it's the mechanic of fleet presence. To view it, yes, you guessed it, there is a map mode for it. And this is roughly how it looks. In a given location, many countries can have maritime presence simultaneously, with the value ranging from 0 to 100, that is the maximum. The higher the value, the slower it grows, because decay increases. Your fleet and certain locations with bonuses contribute positively to maritime presence. Locations gain this bonus from two things. First, port capacity. Second, special buildings you can construct in them, for example, naval batteries. As for the fleet, this part is very simple. The more ships you have with the highest possible value in this anchor icon statistic, which differs between ship types, the faster maritime presence will grow. The fleet must remain at sea, not in port. You can send it manually to any of these locations, though I personally use select objective option, selecting target areas and sending the fleet on naval patrol. From this list you select the areas you're interested in and then give the fleet the order to operate. The fleet operates not on individual locations but on groups of locations, which unfortunately can only be clearly seen in this list. And when you assign the fleet to operate in several areas, it behaves as follows. Usually it begins where maritime presence is already the highest, and it will remain in that area until one of two things happens. When maritime presence reaches 100 points, the fleet moves to the next area, or when decay and maritime presence balance out and the value becomes 0, then the fleet also moves on. Unfortunately, this behavior may make it seem as if the fleet is doing nothing, but this is not true. Now let's move on to additional proximity sources outside your capital. The matter is simple. At the beginning of the game, there is only one such source, called the Bailiff, a building from the military group that you can construct. But importantly, those 20 proximity points do not stack, and worse, they increase the power of the nobility. These buildings are not meant to be spammed, they are placed in strategic locations. If you look closely, here I have one built, and it also spreads its proximity to surrounding locations as long as costs allow. Medina is located between two locations that contain a Bailiff, but only one of them works for it. The game simply considers it the best, most efficient source. It does not stack. With technological progress, more such sources will appear. Here are viceroyalties, which can be built in overseas colonies, available only to the Iberian group, but I see that their earlier counterpart is available already from the start of the game, and with such buildings, you will increase local proximity sources outside the capital. The entire topic of proximity to the capital is now covered, so let's move on to control, which is definitely the most important statistic in this game, because it reflects your authority over every single location in your country. Its maximum value is 100, which means you have full authority over a given location and suffer no penalties. Well, okay, you do suffer one penalty because of mercenaries. The minimum value is 0. And such a province is literally worthless to you, because from practically every angle that location receives a 100% penalty to everything. It is control that determines how much you will earn from a given location, which can be seen more precisely in the tooltip when you hover over the tax base information. For this location, it is 0, because it has been reduced by 100%. How much manpower or sailors you will get from buildings you will eventually construct here. How quickly a given community will progress to higher levels and then find employment, which in short means it will progress from peasants to higher social classes such as workers, clergy or nobility. The size of the levies from a given location also depends on control. The only positive aspect, you will be able to hire more mercenaries. So yes, low control is very bad. But do you remember how I told you a moment ago that it makes the province worthless? Well, to be honest, I lied to you, because control has no real impact on resources extracted from RGOs. True, you won't earn anything from it via taxation, but you will still produce the resource, which will enter the market, and you can then sell it through trade. And control likewise has no impact on production in buildings. You simply won't earn anything through taxes, but you will earn through trade. My amber production and sales illustrate this best. Despite low control and earning practically nothing from taxes, I still make a lot of money selling amber to Venice and other countries. This means that control is extremely important in locations where you want to earn a lot from taxes. Most often these are towns and large cities around your capital, where you have a lot of workshops and other processing facilities, because here you can get very high taxes. Or you have a very large population, which allows you to have a sizable number of levies and later a regular army. And it is far less valuable in places where you only want to extract some resource, which you will later process in the aforementioned locations. So since you understand what approach you should take toward control, where it matters and where it doesn't, we can move on to the stage of how to increase it. And fortunately, this mechanic is much easier in this regard than the one I discussed earlier, namely proximity to the capital. Because here we are dealing solely with percentage modifiers, where proximity to the capital is simply the most important of these modifiers. Next in line, the most important factor is the type of core that a given location has. You can see this information here, or alternatively in the military tab. There is also a map mode for this, of course there is, which informs you of the core status of given locations. The red color means that it is a recently conquered location, and in theory you have no administrative authority there. This gives a few negative effects, including a 10% reduction to control. Such a location can be converted into an integrated location. This one already gets a 5% bonus to control. You can integrate a location first by using your advisor and his cabinet action called Integrate Province. Another way is releasing a new vassal in these locations. However, if it is not a historical vassal with cores on these territories, he will also have to integrate them before, after 10 years, you can begin annexing him. Locations you receive after annexing a vassal usually already have the integrated status. You can then upgrade an integrated location into a core location. This is the third and highest level, which increases maximum control by 20%. And on its own, without anyone's help, it generates control growth. And now, for a location to change color from yellow to green, one thing must happen. Go to the demographics tab, and here at least 50% of the population living in the location must be of an accepted culture, meaning one with a silver icon. You can achieve this by changing the status of a given culture first to tolerated and then to accepted. Another way is using an advisor action to assimilate the given culture into one of your accepted cultures. And here I want to note one more thing. This accepted population requirement practically changes every patch. In version 1.0 it was 30%, currently it is 50% as I said, so as you can see, Paradox balances it a lot, and it is worth checking on the EU4 wiki what the currently required value is. Every location also has its rank, with the lowest being a rural settlement. Rural settlements have no bonus or penalty to control, then such rural settlements, if the requirements are met, namely 5,000 population, can be upgraded to a town. Towns already provide 5% increased control. Then, when you have at least 30,000 population, a town can be upgraded to a city, which is the third and highest form of location where control is increased by 10%. Moreover, both in towns and cities you can construct buildings which gradually increase control. For example, temples an additional 5%. And yes, as technology progresses, more such buildings will appear. Now we move on to population happiness, which is solely a negative factor affecting control. In short, the more satisfied the population is, the smaller the penalty it gives to control. Yes, I also think people are just problems. The maximum penalty to control is, I think, 10%. To check why a given population is unhappy, simply click on these icons, then hover over these percentages here, and you have everything they complain about listed. Most often it is the lack of cultural acceptance, religious differences, but also the demand for certain goods. And this last one is very easy to fix by importing the required goods into the market the location belongs to. A population with happiness below 27% is more likely to join rebels. In theory, rebellions should break out faster. And above this percentage, it becomes loyal. Fewer people will join the rebels, and as a result, there will be fewer uprisings. A very interesting factor affecting your control in a location is the army. Both professional troops and levies increase control in the location where they are present, but also in the province to which the location belongs, where the troops are stationed. Ultimately, however, this always ends up being more costly than the bonus we get from these extra percentages of control, because the army becomes more expensive to maintain over time. So I would treat this as a bonus you get, because your army must be stationed somewhere during peacetime, not as a strategy where you need several thousand troops in every location. Another fairly effective method of increasing control is using the cabinet action, which becomes better the administrative ability of your advisor is. Personally, however, I use this option very rarely, possibly only in very valuable locations, for example those with silver or gold. Advisors in the cabinet usually have better things to do, and besides, this control begins to fall once the action expires. Of course, there are also many random events that will increase or decrease control. On the negative side, there are sometimes privileges that reduce it. I haven't yet seen a privilege that increases it. Maybe one exists, but if so, I must have missed it. Forms of government usually indirectly affect control, most often through modifiers to proximity, as I showed earlier. A good strategy for increasing control in areas far from your capital is releasing a vassal. Every vassal has their own capital, so proximity will be calculated from their capital to all surrounding locations. A vassal will also usually have the primary culture and religion present in these locations, so the population will be somewhat happier. And because of that, they can provide quite a lot of money. At the same time, the goods from these locations go to the market, which you usually control and dominate anyway. And essentially that wraps up the topic of control in the country. There remains one last mechanic to explain: market access, which is probably the most commonly ignored mechanic in all the economic guides I watched while preparing this material, and learning how it works can make several dozen extra gold slip into your budget. This mechanic essentially affects two main things. First, it determines which market each location belongs to. You can see this by hovering over the market access icon, which exists for every location. Here a list expands, showing the attraction of markets for this location. And the location always belongs to the first market on the list. All of this is recalculated monthly, so yes, locations can change the market they belong to. But if you look closely at the numbers, market access does not correspond to market attraction. And that's because a location is also further modified by the attraction of the market it currently belongs to. And the attraction of that market is influenced by several modifiers, but I will talk more about that in the trade guide. Then the next statistic is market protection, which is higher the higher control you have in your location. Later in the game, a new value will appear, mercantilism, and it will also increase market protection. But as you can see from these three values, market access is definitely the most important. And here at the very bottom, it is plainly written how to increase this market access. And I will show you an example using the province of Chumphon, how all of this is calculated. Because basically it works almost the same as proximity. You have a path that leads from location to location all the way to the trade center of that market. Except, unfortunately, there is no summary at the end of all of this. You have to check every single location, how each one affects the next, and you will see that sea transport is much more efficient than land transport between locations. Again, roads are a bonus here, upstream river transport. But look how extremely efficient downstream river transport is, and we also have the mechanic of exiting a port and entering a port. That's why sometimes there is nothing you can do and you simply have to open the settings or the market map and click the option to create a market or move the market capital, taking into consideration basically the same parameters as with proximity. And yes, it is good practice that your capital should also be your trade capital. Otherwise, it may cause exactly what happened in my Khmer playthrough. My most profitable province does not have full access to the market. There was a saying that by teaching, we learn the most. And unfortunately, this will affect the second most important thing that market access influences, the production efficiency of output goods of all buildings and your profit from RGOs. And these two matters must be clearly distinguished. And this is well explained in this part of the tooltip. When it comes to production buildings, things are very simple, because everything is very clearly described in the tooltip when you hover over any production building. Market access appears in this place, and then you can check the exact production by hovering over the product's icon. And it is clear that my base production, which is 1 per level, has been reduced or rather multiplied by 0.73. Which means that instead of producing 18 units of moonshine, I produce barely 13. A pathetic waste. And it's simply very inefficient. It's a bit more complicated if we look at the tooltip in RGOs. Here, control appears nowhere. But the previous tooltip mentioned profit, so you hover and check if it's true, and there is not a single word about market access here. Then you hover over the icon and market access has no impact on anything. So how do you check if this is true? The same province, once when we have 73% market access and once when we have 100%. You can see the difference. To test it, I simply move the market center because it is an instantaneous action. And thanks to that, you have proof that I am telling the truth. What surprised me is that market access has no effect on how much raw resource you extract and send to the market, which is even more clearly visible when we compare the market before and after moving the center. Exactly the same amount of raw resource reaches the market. And that is why I am changing my opinion about markets. It is not worth having one hypermarket or a very large market, because what truly matters is the income you generate. And it does not matter whether this income comes from your internal markets or external ones. So it is worth creating new markets, you just need to do it wisely. First, I believe that the market capital and the country capital should be the exact same location. Second, the minimum condition for creating another market is establishing it in a city that has the maximum level of a marketplace. Then I would add at least 2 towns, and ideally 2 cities, and also fully upgrade their marketplaces. And this is to prevent the new market from choking and suddenly finding that it has no trade capacity. And when selecting new capitals for future markets, I would follow exactly the same criteria as when moving the main capital, which means upper river flow, a road network around it, but terrain type and vegetation do not matter. I see no indication that they affect distance to the market in any way. Unfortunately, there is no detailed information in the tooltip, and the forest tooltip also shows no influence on market access. So in this respect, it is somewhat easier to choose a new location for the new market capital. Additionally, the market map also helps us choose the next location, because the brighter the color visible on this map, the higher the market access. The darker the shade, the lower the market access. So of course, if there is a narrow passage here, you need to look somewhere around it for a new market center. Another thing market access determines is the order in which locations receive access to goods from the market and access to food supplies from the market. So if a location has low market access, it may run out of food, as well as run out of resources needed for production. And exactly how to build your production, how to transfer resources, how to flood foreign markets, you will learn from the material I will prepare soon. Or it already exists, because who knows when you are watching this.